In the depths of the Great Depression, when hope seemed as scarce as steady work and families were torn apart by poverty and desperation, some stories emerged that would challenge everything people believed about survival, dignity, and the power of the human spirit. This is one of those stories. It takes place in Millbrook, Tennessee, in the autumn of 1930, a town where the bank owned more homes than the people who lived in them, where breadlines formed before dawn, and where a man's worth was measured not by his character, but by how much money he still had left. But this is not just a story about the Depression. It's about a young woman who found herself in an impossible situation and chose to transform it into something extraordinary. It's about how one person's courage can light a fire that spreads through an entire community, changing hearts and minds in ways that no amount of money ever could. What happened in Millbrook that harsh winter would force its citizens to confront their assumptions about power, sacrifice, and what it truly means to rise above circumstances that seem insurmountable. They would witness something none of them saw coming: the emergence of a leader from the most unexpected place, during the darkest of times. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The November wind cut through Main Street like a blade, carrying the smell of wood smoke and desperation. Snow threatened in the gray sky above, and the few people brave enough to venture outside walked quickly, their heads down, collars turned up against the cold and the harsh reality of their circumstances. Harold Pemberton's black Packard automobile was one of the few vehicles still running in Millbrook. At 55, Harold was the town's banker, the man who held the mortgages on half the homes and the power to destroy the other half. The Depression had been kind to Harold in the cruelest way possible. While others lost everything, he accumulated more. Foreclosed farms, abandoned businesses, desperate families selling their possessions for pennies on the dollar. All of it flowed through Harold's hands, making him richer while making him more isolated and bitter. Years of rich food and moral poverty had left Harold corpulent and cruel, a man who believed that in times like these, money was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that could buy happiness, respect, or love. The Packard pulled up to the Millbrook County Courthouse, its engine purring while horse-drawn carts and men on foot struggled through the muddy streets. Beside Harold sat Elena Vasquez, 18 years old and beautiful in the way that poverty couldn't quite extinguish. Her dark hair was carefully pinned, her simple dress clean, but obviously mended multiple times. She possessed a quiet dignity that seemed to burn brighter against the backdrop of these desperate times. "Remember our arrangement?" Harold wheezed as they approached the courthouse steps, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. "You get security, food, shelter. I get a wife and companionship. It's more than most people have these days." Elena's gloved hands clenched briefly before relaxing. "I understand the terms, Mr. Pemberton." Inside the courthouse, the clerk, Mrs. Betty Morrison, had been working the marriage desk for 20 years. She'd seen desperate unions before. The Depression had brought many of them, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of Harold Pemberton and this young woman. "We're here for a marriage license," Harold announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who owned half the town's debt. Mrs. Morrison's pen hesitated above her ledger. She looked from Harold to Elena, her weathered face struggling to maintain professional composure. In these times, she'd learned not to judge too harshly. Everyone was doing what they had to do to survive. "Of course, Mr. Pemberton. I'll need to see identification from both parties." As Elena signed the marriage documents, her handwriting was elegant and sure, the penmanship of someone who had received a good education before circumstances changed. Harold's excitement was palpable, his breathing heavy with anticipation and the effort of simply existing in his oversized body. "You'll never want for anything, my dear," he murmured, his pudgy hand attempting to cover hers. "While others are losing their homes, you'll have comfort, security, everything a woman could need." Elena didn't pull away, but her voice when she spoke was quietly firm. "Security isn't something that can be bought, Mr. Pemberton. It's something that must be built." By afternoon, despite the economic hardships that usually dominated conversation, the story had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. At Porter's General Store, where customers now bought on credit and hope, Millie Jenkins whispered to anyone who would listen, "That poor child, selling herself to that terrible man. These are desperate times, but surely there were other ways. At Murphy's Tavern, where men gathered to share rumors and forget their troubles, the conversation was harsher. "It's disgusting," declared Tom Harrison, who'd lost his barbershop to the bank 3 months earlier. "A man like that, buying a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. Just because he's got money doesn't make it right." But it was Martha Caldwell, the preacher's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of the town, who crystallized the general sentiment as she spoke to the ladies' church auxiliary. "That girl has made her choice. Money over morality, comfort over character. We can pray for her soul, but we cannot condone such behavior, depression or no depression." What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that Elena Vasquez had indeed made a choice. But it wasn't the choice they assumed. That evening, as the early winter darkness fell over Millbrook, Elena sat in the small room she rented above the bakery, the place that had been her home since her parents died in the influenza outbreak 2 years earlier. Mrs. O'Brien, the baker's wife, sat with her at the small wooden table. "Are you certain about this path, child?" Mrs. O'Brien asked, her Irish accent thick with concern. "There might be other ways. Maybe work in the city, or—" Elena looked out the window at the soup kitchen line forming in the church basement across the street. Men who had once been proud farmers, shopkeepers, and skilled workers now waited for a bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread. Children wore coats that were too small and shoes with holes, their faces gaunt from hunger. "Mrs. O'Brien, this town is dying," Elena said quietly. "People are losing their homes, their farms, their hope. Harold Pemberton has the power to help, but he only knows how to take. Someone needs to show him how to give. And you think marrying him will change his heart?" Elena's smile was enigmatic, touched with something that might have been determination. "I think Harold Pemberton is about to discover that his new wife has very strong opinions about how wealth should be used in times like these." Mrs. O'Brien studied the young woman, seeing not the victim the town imagined, but someone with a plan that went deeper than anyone suspected. "And what about you, Elena? What happens to your heart in all this?" Elena's gaze remained fixed on the soup line. "Sometimes one person's sacrifice can save many others. If my heart is the price for this town's survival, then that's a price I'm willing to pay." The wedding took place on a bitter Saturday morning in December at the Millbrook Methodist Church. The sanctuary, usually warmed by the presence of the faithful, felt cold and empty despite the coal stove burning in the corner. Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the town in a blanket of white that made the poverty seem less harsh, but no less real. Elena arrived on foot, having walked the 3 blocks from her room above the bakery. She wore a simple white dress that Mrs. O'Brien had sewn from fabric donated by the church ladies, an act of kindness that spoke to the complexity of the town's feelings about this union. Despite its humble origins, Elena's natural grace transformed the simple dress into something elegant. The church was sparsely populated. Harold had no close friends. His business dealings had made him wealthy but isolated. Elena's only supporters were Mrs. O'Brien and a few of the women from the soup kitchen who had come to know her through her volunteer work. The rest of the congregation consisted of townspeople who had come out of curiosity and, in some cases, resentment. Harold stood at the altar in his expensive suit, specially tailored to accommodate his considerable girth. His face was flushed with excitement and the effort of simply standing, his breathing audible even over the whispered conversations of the sparse congregation. As Elena walked down the aisle, the whispers began immediately. "Look at her, calm as you please. Probably already planning how to spend his money. Poor thing, what choice did she have? These are desperate times. That man should be ashamed, taking advantage of a girl with no family to protect her." But Dr. James Sullivan, the town's physician who had been pressed into service as Harold's best man, saw something different in Elena's face. Where others saw resignation, he saw resolve. Where they saw submission, he saw the quiet strength of someone who had made peace with the difficult decision. Reverend Caldwell, Martha's husband, performed the ceremony with obvious reluctance. His usually warm voice was formal and cold as he spoke the traditional words. When he reached the part about objections, The silence was heavy with unspoken disapproval. Harold's "I do" was breathless with anticipation. Elena's was clear and steady, her voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Caldwell announced with barely concealed distaste. Harold leaned in eagerly, but Elena turned her cheek at the last moment, allowing only the briefest contact. "Save that for when we're alone," she whispered, though her tone was more instruction than invitation. The reception was held in the church basement, a modest affair that Harold had insisted on despite the town's economic struggles. He had arranged for food from the hotel in the county seat, a display of wealth that felt almost obscene given the breadlines forming outside. Elena moved through the small gathering with quiet dignity, speaking to each guest, asking about their families, their struggles, their hopes. Her behavior was so unexpected that it began to unsettle the very people who had come to judge her. "She's quite gracious," admitted Mrs. Peterson, the mayor's wife, to her husband. "Not all what I expected." "Still doesn't change what she's doing," Mayor Peterson replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The most significant moment came when Elena approached Martha Caldwell, who had been watching her with barely concealed disapproval. Martha stiffened as Elena approached, prepared for confrontation. "Mrs. Caldwell," Elena said with a warm smile, "I wanted to thank you for your husband's service today. I know this situation has been difficult for many people to understand." Martha's prepared lecture about moral decay died in her throat. Up close, Elena's eyes held no trace of the hardness Martha had expected. Instead, they were intelligent, compassionate, and surprisingly determined. Well, I suppose," Martha stammered. "I hope that in time, you'll see that sometimes what appears to be one thing is actually something quite different," Elena continued gently. "These are difficult times for everyone. Perhaps we can find common ground in our shared desire to help those who need it most." As the afternoon wore on, Harold grew increasingly impatient. His new bride had been the perfect hostess, but she had somehow managed to avoid any real physical contact with him throughout the entire event. When he approached her to suggest they retire to the bridal suite he had prepared at his mansion, Elena's response caught him off guard. "I have a different suggestion," she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that Harold had never heard before. "I think we should spend our first evening as a married couple serving dinner at the soup kitchen." Harold's face went from confusion to outrage. "What? Elena, this is our wedding night. I have plans." "And I have plans too," Elena interrupted smoothly. "Marriage is about partnership, Harold, about shared values and common goals. If we're going to build a life together, shouldn't it be a life of service to others?" The few guests who overheard this exchange were stunned. This was not the behavior of someone who had sold herself for security. This was the behavior of someone with her own agenda. Dr. Sullivan, who had been observing Elena carefully throughout the reception, felt the first stirrings of admiration. He was beginning to suspect that Harold Pemberton had gotten far more than he'd bargained for. The soup kitchen operated out of the basement of the First Presbyterian Church, a converted space that had become a lifeline for Millbrook's growing population of unemployed and homeless. As Harold's Packard pulled up to the modest building, his face was a mask of barely contained fury. "This is absurd, Elena. I've prepared a suite for us, champagne flowers. And tomorrow it will all still be there," Elena replied calmly, stepping out of the car in her wedding dress. "Tonight, we're going to do something meaningful." Harold remained in the car, his breathing heavy with frustration and the cold air. "I'm not going in there. Those people are. They're beneath us. They made their choices, and now they're paying the price." Elena turned back to face him, and for the first time since their arrangement began, her composure showed a crack, not of fear, but of something that might have been disappointment. "No one is beneath us, Harold. If you truly want to be married to me, you'll need to understand that the measure of a man isn't what he owns, but what he gives." She paused, studying his red face. "But I won't force you. Stay in the car if you prefer. I'll be inside." For the next 3 hours, Elena served soup, cut bread, and sat with the kitchen's patrons, listening to their stories with genuine interest and compassion. Word spread quickly through the small facility that the banker's new wife, still in her wedding dress, was volunteering on her wedding night. "Ain't that something?" murmured Frank Morrison, a farmer who'd lost his land to the bank 6 months earlier. "Never thought I'd see the day." Elena knelt beside his chair, her white dress spread around her like a cloud. "Tell me about your farm, Frank. What did you grow?" For the first time in months, Frank found himself talking about something other than his next meal. He told Elena about his cornfields, about the cattle he'd raised, about the drought that had destroyed 3 years of crops in a row. When he finished, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Feels good to remember it was real," he whispered. "Sometimes I think I dreamed it all." "It was real," Elena replied firmly. "And it can be real again. Sometimes we just need to find a different way forward." Outside, Harold sat in his car, watching through the frosted windows as his new bride moved among the town's failures and outcasts with the grace of a born leader. Dr. Sullivan, who had followed them out of concern, tapped on the passenger window. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his breath creating clouds in the cold air. Harold unlocked the door with a grunt. "This isn't what I expected, document." "What did you expect, Harold?" The question hung in the frigid air between them. Harold's face cycled through several emotions before settling on confusion. "I expected gratitude, submission, a woman who would appreciate what I could give her." "And what can you give her?" "Security, wealth, protection from all of this." Harold gestured toward the soup kitchen with disgust. Dr. Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "And what did she give you?" Harold's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" "In your arrangement, Harold, what did Elena receive from you? And what did you receive from her?" Harold opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, looking through the window at Elena, who was now reading a story to a group of children whose fathers had no work. Harold began to understand that he might have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their arrangement. Inside, Elena was having a conversation that would change everything. Mrs. O'Brien had arrived with several other women from the church, bringing additional supplies and helping hands. As they worked together in the kitchen, Elena began to explain what she had really planned. "The arrangement with Harold, it was never about the money for me," she said quietly as they ladled soup into bowls. "It was about access." Mrs. O'Brien's eyebrows rose. "Access to what, child?" "To power, to influence, to the ability to change things." Elena's voice was steady, but her eyes held a fire that hadn't been there before. "Harold Pemberton controls the financial life of this town. He has the power to save farms, to keep businesses open, to help families stay in their homes. But he doesn't know how to use that power for good. And you think marrying him will change his heart?" Elena's smile was enigmatic. "I think Harold is about to discover that his new wife has very strong opinions about how a bank should serve its community. We're going to restructure the foreclosure process. We're going to create payment plans that families can actually afford. We're going to start a fund for emergency loans at fair interest rates." Mrs. O'Brien stared at her. "Elena, marriage doesn't give you control over his business. Men don't listen to their wives about such things." "Harold will listen," Elena said with quiet confidence, "because I'm going to show him that there's more than one way to be wealthy. True wealth isn't just about money. It's about being part of a community that thrives. It's about building something that lasts." "And if he refuses?" Elena's expression grew more serious. "Then I'll find other ways to accomplish what needs to be done. But I believe that deep down, Harold wants to be more than just a man who takes from others. He wants to be respected, admired, even loved. I'm going to show him how to earn those things." At that moment, Harold himself appeared in the doorway of the soup kitchen, his expensive coat dusted with snow. He looked uncertain, clearly uncomfortable, but making an effort. Elena watched him approach, and for the first time all evening, her smile was genuinely warm. "Harold," she said, "I'd like you to meet some of our neighbors." For the next hour, Harold found himself in conversations unlike any he'd had in years. Frank told him about the challenges of farming in increasingly difficult conditions. Mary Sullivan, Dr. Sullivan's wife, explained how medical bills had bankrupted her family after her son's bout with pneumonia. Thomas Wright, a skilled carpenter, described the frustration of having no work despite his abilities. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, Harold was unusually quiet. In the car, he finally spoke. "Elena, I need to understand something." "What is it?" "Why did you really marry me? And please, I want the truth." Elena considered her words carefully. "I married you because I believe you have the power to save this town, Harold. But I also believe you've forgotten what it means to be part of a community instead of just owning it." Harold stared at her, his breath fogging in the cold car. "You want me to help those people? To give them money? I want us to invest in our community's future. I want us to be partners in building something that matters." Elena's voice was passionate now, all pretense gone. "Harold, you have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. But what legacy are you building? What will people remember about Harold Pemberton after he's gone?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "They'll remember that I was successful, that I accumulated wealth when others failed." "Is that enough for you?" Elena asked softly. "Is that the man you want to be?" Christmas Eve, 1930, dawned clear and bitterly cold. The snow that had fallen steadily for 3 days had transformed Millbrook into a winter wonderland. But beneath the beauty lay the harsh reality of families struggling to heat their homes and put food on their tables. Harold stood in his study, looking out at the town he essentially owned, wrestling with thoughts and feelings that had been growing stronger since his wedding night 3 weeks earlier. His marriage to Elena had not gone according to plan. She had been gracious, intelligent, and surprisingly strong-willed, but she had also maintained a distance that frustrated him. More troubling, she had begun to challenge his most fundamental beliefs about money, power, and responsibility. The study door opened, and Elena entered carrying a tea service and a thick folder of documents. Over the past weeks, she had transformed from the quiet, submissive bride Harold had expected into something far more formidable. A partner who treated their marriage like a business arrangement with moral implications. "Good morning, Harold," she said, setting the tea on his desk. "I've prepared something for you to review." Harold eyed the folder suspiciously. "What is it?" "A proposal. A plan for how we can work together to help our community survive these difficult times." Elena opened the folder, revealing pages of carefully written notes, financial calculations, and lists of families in need. Her penmanship was elegant, her arguments logical and compelling. "I've been researching your loan portfolio," she began, her voice businesslike. "Do you realize that 60% of your foreclosures could have been prevented with simple payment restructuring? These families aren't lazy or irresponsible. They're victims of circumstances beyond their control." Harold's face began to redden. "Elena, you don't understand business. These people took out loans they couldn't afford. These people took out loans during prosperous times, and then the economy collapsed." Elena interrupted smoothly. "The question isn't whether they made mistakes. The question is whether you want to be part of the solution or continue to be part of the problem." She turned to a page covered with figures. "Look at this, Harold. The Morrison farm, Frank's place. He owes you $2,400. If you foreclose, you'll eventually sell the property for perhaps $1,500 in this market, after paying for upkeep and taxes. But if you restructure his loan, reduce his payments to $30 a month, he'll pay you back in full over 7 years. Which makes more financial sense?" Harold studied the numbers, his businessman's mind immediately grasping the logic. "But what if he defaults anyway? Then you foreclose at that point." "But Harold, Frank Morrison has been farming that land for 20 years. He knows every acre, every season, every crop that will grow there. He's not going to walk away if you give him a chance to succeed." Over the next 2 hours, Elena walked Harold through case after case, showing him how compassion and business sense could work together. Her arguments were compelling, her research thorough, and her passion undeniable. "You're asking me to change everything," Harold said finally. "To give up control, to trust people who have already proven they can't pay their debts." "I'm asking you to lead," Elena replied. "To be the man who saved Millbrook instead of the man who owned it while it died." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "What do you get out of this, Elena? Why do you care so much about these people? Elena's answer was simple but profound. Because I am these people, Harold. Before I married you, I was one meal away from hunger, one rent payment away from homelessness. The only difference between me and the woman in the soup kitchen is luck and opportunity. I can't forget that, and I don't want to. That afternoon, Harold did something that shocked the entire town. He walked into the soup kitchen, not reluctantly, as he had on his wedding night, but purposefully. He asked to speak to every family that owed him money, and one by one, he began to restructure their loans. Frank Morrison broke down and cried when Harold offered him a payment plan that would save his farm. Mary Sullivan wept with relief when Harold forgave the medical debt that had been crushing her family. Thomas Wright shook Harold's hand with tears in his eyes when the banker offered to finance a new carpentry business. Word spread through the town like wildfire. The banker who had been feared and resented was suddenly offering hope instead of despair. But the most remarkable transformation was in Harold himself. For the first time in years, he saw gratitude instead of fear in people's eyes. He heard "thank you" instead of muttered curses when he walked down the street. That evening, as they sat by the fire in Harold's mansion, Elena finally allowed herself to relax for the first time since their wedding. The impossible had happened. She had reached Harold's heart and shown him a different way to live. "Elena," Harold said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from her needlework, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "I know why you married me now," he continued, "and I know it wasn't for love, or even for money. You married me to save this town." Elena set down her needlework, meeting his eyes directly. "Yes, I did. And I married you because I thought I could buy companionship, maybe even affection." Harold's voice was heavy with regret. "I was wrong about a lot of things." "Were you?" Elena asked gently. "Harold, what we've built over these past weeks, is it so different from affection? We're partners now, working towards something meaningful. Isn't that a kind of love?" Harold looked at her with wonder. "You mean you could actually care for me, despite everything?" Elena's smile was warm and genuine. "I already do care for you, Harold. Not because you're my husband, but because you chose to become the man I believed you could be." As the church bells rang out across Millbrook that Christmas Eve, announcing the birth of hope in the darkest of times, Harold Pemberton reached across the space between their chairs and took his wife's hand. For the first time in his life, he felt truly wealthy, not because of what he owned, but because of what he had chosen to give. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the mansion and throughout the town, something warmer than any fire was beginning to burn. The knowledge that even in the darkest times, one person's courage could light the way for an entire community. Elena had not just saved Millbrook, she had saved Harold's soul. And in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from transforming them into allies in the fight for something better. The girl who had seemed to sell herself for security had instead purchased something far more valuable: the power to change hearts, transform lives, and prove that even in the depths of despair, hope could still triumph over fear. 5 years later, in 1935, Millbrook had become known throughout Tennessee as the town that survived the Depression through cooperation and compassion. The Pemberton Community Fund had helped dozens of families keep their homes and businesses. The town's unemployment rate was the lowest in the region, and Harold Pemberton was no longer feared. He was respected and, surprisingly, beloved. Elena Pemberton had become the unofficial mayor of Millbrook, organizing community events, mediating disputes, and continuing to find new ways to help those in need. She had transformed not just Harold's business practices, but his entire approach to life. And Harold himself? He had lost weight, gained friends, and discovered the joy of being part of something larger than himself. He still ran the bank, but now he ran it as a pillar of the community rather than its master. Most remarkably, what had begun as a transaction had slowly, naturally, become something deeper. Harold and Elena had found in each other not just partners in community service, but genuine companionship and, yes, love. Perhaps not the passionate romance of fairy tales, but the deep, abiding affection of two people who had chosen to build something beautiful together. The town that had once whispered about the banker who bought himself a wife, now spoke with pride about the couple who had saved their community. Elena Vasquez Pemberton had proved that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is not money or violence, but the simple courage to refuse to be defined by other people's expectations. In the end, she had gotten exactly what she planned for, not security or wealth, but the power to transform lives and build something that would last far beyond her own lifetime. And Harold had received something far more valuable than the submissive young wife he had tried to purchase. He had gained a partner, a purpose, and the respect of his community. The girl who had surprised everyone had, in the end, surprised herself most of all, by discovering that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating our circumstances, but from transforming them into opportunities to serve something greater than ourselves. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.